She gave a Christmas gift to a Mafia boss. His hands shook when he faced a single mom. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Jane had always kept a low profile. A single mom in her late 20s, she spent her days juggling work and caring for her 6-year-old daughter, Lily. They lived a quiet life in a small apartment, far removed from the luxury and chaos of the upper world. Christmas was always a special time for them. It wasn't about the expensive gifts or lavish celebrations. It was about making sure Lily knew how much she was loved. But this year was different. Jane had something special planned. It was a gift she never thought she'd be giving, especially not to someone like him. David Romano was a name that sent shivers down the spine of anyone who knew it. A Mafia boss, powerful, feared, and untouchable. He was a man who had everything: money, influence, and power, but no one would ever dare to say that he had heart. Jane had never expected to meet him, let alone speak to him. But fate had other plans. A chance encounter at a charity event led her to cross paths with the notorious Mafia boss. She hadn't known much about him, just that he was ruthless and dangerous, a man who operated in the shadows of society. Still, when she saw him at the event, there was a moment where their eyes locked, and something unspoken passed between them. Maybe it was the kindness in her heart that made her do it, or perhaps it was the impulse to do something for someone who seemed so out of place in her world. She had brought a small gift for him. Something simple, a handcrafted wooden box she had made herself, engraved with delicate patterns. It was a gift that held no grand value, but to her, it symbolized something more, a gesture of kindness in a world that often seemed so cold. She had no idea what he would do with it, but when she handed it to him, she saw the surprise in his eyes. It was a rare moment of vulnerability for David Romano. For the first time in years, his hands shook as he took the gift from her. In that brief moment, something inside him shifted. He wasn't used to receiving gifts. He was used to taking, controlling, demanding. Yet here he was, standing before a woman who offered him something without expecting anything in return. It was a small moment, but for David, it felt like a crack in the armor he had built around himself. He didn't say much, just nodded and thanked her, but Jane could see it. She could see that he was affected, even if he didn't fully understand why. It was a moment that would change everything. Jane wasn't looking for anything from him. She wasn't trying to manipulate or charm him. She was just a mother who wanted to spread a little Christmas cheer. But David Romano was no ordinary man, and no ordinary gift would ever go unnoticed by him. His world was filled with shadows and fear, but for the first time, he felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. And it all started with a simple gift from a woman who had no idea what kind of power she had just unleashed. David stood still, the small wooden box still clutched in his hand, as Jane walked away, her back disappearing into the crowd. He stared down at the intricate patterns etched into the wood, something about it catching his eye in a way he couldn't explain. For a moment, the world around him seemed to fade. The sharp clinks of champagne glasses, the low hum of conversations, it all drowned out as he looked at the gift. He had been given many things in his life: wealth, power, loyalty, but never something so simple, so genuine. It unsettled him. The men around him, his associates, the ones who kept him anchored in his world of shadows and control, were watching him closely. But they couldn't see what he felt. They couldn't see the tightness in his chest, the flutter of confusion. He placed the box carefully. In his pocket, a strange heaviness weighing down his thoughts. His world had always been one of calculation, of taking what he wanted when he wanted. But Jane, she was different. She had given him something without expecting anything in return, and that alone made her dangerous. His hands, which had never trembled before, were shaking ever so slightly as he turned away, trying to push the sensation aside. He didn't have time for this. He couldn't afford to. But as he moved through the party, his mind kept returning to her, to the way her eyes held something soft, something warm, that he hadn't seen in years. Later that night, back in his penthouse, the box still lingered in his mind. It sat on the table beside him, as he stared out the window, overlooking the city that never stopped. He was used to being the one who controlled everything, the one who made the rules. But Jane had given him a glimpse into something else, something he didn't know how to handle. He was a mafia boss, and she was just a woman who had somehow wormed her way into his thoughts. He picked up his phone, his fingers moving automatically as he typed a message to his assistant. "Find out everything about her," he ordered. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a command. It was something deeper, something that had slipped past his usual guard. Jane had no idea what she had started. The next day, David found himself sitting across from his most trusted associate, Sergio, in a dimly lit room. Sergio was a man of few words, a man who knew how to stay in the background, how to move in silence. But today, even he noticed the shift in David's demeanor. "Something's bothering you, boss," Sergio remarked, his voice low, almost casual. David didn't answer immediately. His mind was still on Jane, on that moment when her eyes met his, when he saw the kindness and the honesty that no one else in his world had. He had spent so many years building an empire, ruling over everything with an iron fist. But Jane had made him question it all. "Find out who she is," David finally said, his voice more controlled, more dangerous than usual. Sergio nodded, not asking questions. He had learned long ago that when David spoke, it wasn't a suggestion. It was a directive. David's thoughts kept circling back to Jane, to her life, her struggles, her warmth. There was a pull in her that he couldn't ignore, a softness that threatened to break through the hard shell he had built. And that terrified him, because he had spent years building that shell for a reason. He couldn't afford to let anyone in. But Jane had managed to slip past his defenses in a way no one else had. And now, as the days passed, he found himself looking for reasons to see her again, to understand her, to see if she could break through the walls he had so carefully constructed. But what he didn't know was that this wasn't just about a gift anymore. This was about something deeper, something he couldn't yet comprehend, something that would change both of their lives forever. David had never been one to back down from a challenge, but what he was feeling now was different. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something about Jane that unsettled him. She wasn't like the other women he had met throughout his life, the ones who were drawn to his wealth and power, the ones who knew their place and stayed in line. Jane wasn't intimidated by him, and that fact alone made her stand out. He had been watching her for days now, his assistant reporting back with every little detail of her life. She was a mother, a single mother, raising her daughter, Lily, with nothing more than determination and love. Jane's life wasn't easy, but she made it work. She didn't rely on anyone but herself, and that was something David found oddly admirable. But it was more than admiration. As he sat in his office late one night, looking over the reports about her, he realized that something had shifted inside him. He couldn't just let her go. She had come into his life in a way that he hadn't expected, and now he couldn't seem to stop thinking about her. He wasn't used to feeling this way, this helplessness. The world he ruled was black and white, predictable, but Jane was different. There was an uncertainty to her, a softness, that made him want to protect her, even though he didn't understand why. He found himself thinking about the gift she had given him, the simple wooden box with its intricate carvings. It wasn't about the value, it was about the gesture, about the thought behind it. He had never been given something so pure, so untainted by the world he lived in. The next day, David decided he couldn't wait anymore. He needed to see her. He wasn't sure what he was going to say or do, but he knew that he had to meet her again. He couldn't just let her slip away like everyone else in his life. He had to know more about her, understand why she had such an effect on him. He made the call, and within hours, his team had arranged a meeting. Jane agreed to meet him, although David could tell from the brief exchange that she wasn't entirely sure why she was agreeing to see him again. He was used to people obeying him without question, but Jane was different. When they met, there was an awkwardness in the air, a tension that neither of them knew how to break. David stood tall, his sharp suit fitting him like armor, while Jane was in a simple dress, the same warmth and sincerity she had shown him before radiating from her. "I know you're wondering why I asked you to meet me," David said, his voice steady, but with an underlying softness that surprised even him. "But there's something about you, Jane. Something I can't ignore." Jane raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice cautious but not fearful. "You gave me a gift. Something so simple, But it made me realize I've been living in a world of control and power for so long that I've forgotten what it's like to just feel something real, he continued. Jane's eyes softened slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. I don't know what you want from me, David, she replied, her voice calm but firm. I'm just trying to raise my daughter and survive in this world. David could sense the hesitation in her words, the wall she had built to protect herself and her daughter. But something inside him made him want to break those walls down. I know this is complicated. I'm not asking you to be a part of my world, but I want to be part of yours. I want to understand you, he said, his voice low, his gaze never leaving hers. Jane looked away for a moment, as if weighing his words. She had been through so much in her life, and the last thing she wanted was to get involved with someone like him. But there was something in David's eyes, something that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, she could trust him. I can't promise anything, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I'll give you a chance to prove yourself. David's heart raced, but he kept his composure. He had no idea where this would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had something worth fighting for. That's all I need, he said, his voice steady. And with that, a new chapter in their story began. David's life was already meticulously structured. Every decision was made for him by years of experience, power, and wealth. He didn't allow things to slip out of his control, and yet here he was, sitting across from Jane, a woman who had, without even trying, thrown everything into disarray. She hadn't asked for anything. She wasn't here because she needed him, but the simplicity of that was exactly what made her so compelling. It was late, and they were in a small, quiet restaurant in the city, a place far from the world David usually inhabited. He had chosen it because it felt normal. He didn't want to take Jane to one of his usual spots, where everything was too polished, too fake. This was different. This was real. He watched her as she spoke, her voice soft but steady, as she told him about her life, about her daughter, Lily, and the challenges she faced as a single mother. David had been surrounded by people who always wanted something from him, but Jane wasn't like that. She wasn't looking for anything more than a simple connection, a conversation. It unnerved him, and yet it pulled him in. He found himself listening intently, hanging on every word she said. Jane, for her part, wasn't sure why she was still here. She didn't belong in this world, not in the way he did. She had spent so many years working, surviving, making sure Lily had everything she needed, that she hadn't had the time or energy to think about anything else. But there was something about David that made her want to keep talking, to keep listening. When she looked into his eyes, she saw something different than what she had expected. She saw a man who wasn't just cold and calculating, a man who wasn't just a product of his power. She saw a man who was more than that. And as much as she told herself that it wasn't a good idea, that he was dangerous, that she shouldn't let herself get drawn into his world, she couldn't help it. I didn't expect this, David said, his voice low. Jane looked up, startled by the sincerity in his tone. I didn't expect you to be so real, he continued, his words surprising even himself. It was the first time in a long while that he had been honest with anyone. Jane didn't know how to respond. I'm not looking for anything from you, David, she said softly, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. I'm just trying to live my life and take care of Lily. David nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He had always taken, always controlled. But with her, things were different. She didn't need him to fix anything. She didn't need anything from him at all. And that scared him more than he was willing to admit. I know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But sometimes, just having someone there makes all the difference. Jane met his gaze, feeling the pull between them. For the first time, she wasn't sure what to do with herself. This man, this mafia boss, who had controlled everything in his life, was now looking at her as if he didn't know how to control what was happening between them. And for once, Jane didn't want to run away. I don't know where this is going, she said, her voice hesitant. But I'm willing to find out. David smiled, a genuine smile, something that didn't often appear on his face. I'm not going to make this easy for you, he said, his voice filled with a mixture of amusement and something deeper, something that hinted at the vulnerability he rarely allowed anyone to see. Jane couldn't help but smile back, despite herself. I don't expect it to be easy, she replied, her voice steady but filled with curiosity. And just like that, something between them shifted. Something was starting and neither of them knew exactly where it would lead. But for the first time in a long time, neither of them was afraid to find out. The days following their conversation felt like a blur to Jane. She was still processing everything that had happened, still trying to make sense of the unexpected connection she had with David. She had never expected someone like him to even glance in her direction, let alone make her feel seen. As much as she tried to focus on her daily life, her work, and Lily, her thoughts kept drifting back to him. He was everywhere. His presence loomed in the corners of her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. David, on the other hand, found himself thinking about Jane more than he was willing to admit. He had always prided himself on his ability to control every situation, but with her, nothing seemed to follow the usual script. She was real, in a way that no one else was. There were no agendas, no games. She was raw, honest, and, for some reason, that terrified him. He had known the world of power and manipulation, where everyone had a price, where loyalty was bought, not earned. But Jane wasn't like that. He had never been so vulnerable before. Even his associates had noticed the change in him. Sergio, his most trusted advisor, had caught on quickly. "You've been distant, boss," Sergio had said one day, his tone casual but sharp. "What's going on?" David had simply shrugged, his eyes focused on the paperwork in front of him. "Nothing," he had replied, but Sergio had known better. "You're not going to tell me it's nothing, are you?" Sergio pressed. David had exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "It's just complicated," he finally admitted, though he couldn't bring himself to say more. He wasn't sure what Jane had done to him, but he couldn't ignore the pull he felt towards her. It wasn't just physical attraction, it was something deeper, something that made him want to be a better person, even though he didn't know how. And that scared him. The day after their conversation at the restaurant, David had found himself at a crossroads. He had never done anything like this before, chasing after someone, trying to build something that didn't fit neatly into his world. But he couldn't stop thinking about Jane, about her warmth, about the way she made him feel. He decided to visit her, something he hadn't planned but couldn't resist. He showed up at her small apartment building, unsure of what he was expecting but certain of one thing. He had to see her again. When Jane opened the door, her surprise was palpable. "David," she said, her voice soft but filled with hesitation. "What are you doing here?" He met her gaze, his expression serious but not cold. "I couldn't stop thinking about you," he said simply, "and I thought maybe you'd like to have coffee with me." It was a simple offer, but to Jane, it felt like a leap. She had no idea where this was going, no idea if she should even entertain the idea of letting him in. But something about his vulnerability, his openness, made her want to say yes. After a moment, she stepped aside, allowing him into the apartment. The warmth inside was a stark contrast to the chill of the world outside, and it felt like a quiet moment of peace. They sat at her small kitchen table, sipping coffee, talking about everything and nothing. It was the first time in a long while that Jane had felt like she could just breathe, without the weight of responsibilities pressing down on her. David, too, felt a sense of calm he hadn't realized he was missing. It was as if, for that moment, the world outside didn't matter. It was just the two of them. And for once, David didn't feel the need to be in control. As they spoke, Jane found herself softening, the walls she had carefully built around her heart beginning to crack. She wasn't sure where this would go, but she was willing to take the chance. For the first time in ages, she allowed herself to think about something more than survival. She allowed herself to think about happiness. And just like that, a new chapter began to unfold. Neither of them knew exactly where this would lead, but one thing was clear. Neither of them was afraid to find out. Days passed, and Jane found herself falling into a rhythm she hadn't expected. Her life, once a whirlwind of work, parenting, and barely holding everything together, had now shifted into something unexpected, something that made her question the wall she had so carefully built around herself. David continued to reach out, not with grand gestures or power moves, but with simple acts of kindness. It was nothing extravagant, but everything about it felt real. They spent more time together, just talking, getting to know one another in ways neither had anticipated. For Jane, it was a chance to breathe, to remember what it was like to have someone care about her outside of her responsibilities as a mother. And for David, it was an awakening. He hadn't realized how much he had been missing, how much he had been living without the warmth of genuine connection. Every time they met, he found himself more drawn to her, her strength, her kindness, the way she saw the world. She wasn't afraid of him, and that made her even more intriguing. One evening, after another casual dinner, they found themselves sitting together on Jane's couch, the weight of the day easing as they relaxed into each other's company. The city outside buzzed, but inside, there was peace. "I never thought I'd be here," Jane admitted, her voice soft, yet laced with sincerity. "I never thought I'd let anyone in again." David watched her closely, understanding more than she knew. "You're not alone anymore," he said simply. His words were quiet, but they held a promise. Jane met his gaze, unsure of how to respond. For so long, she had built her life around protecting herself and Lily. She hadn't allowed anyone to get close, especially not someone like David. But now, as she sat beside him, she realized that she didn't have to do everything alone. She could let someone in. She could trust. "I don't know what this is," Jane said, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "I don't know where it's going." David gave her a reassuring smile, one that was uncharacteristically gentle for the man he had been before. "Neither do I, but I want to find out." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their unspoken words filling the space between them. It wasn't about grand declarations or promises. It was about something more, a quiet understanding that, for the first time in both of their lives, they didn't have to face the world alone. As they spent more time together, their bond grew stronger. David's visits became a part of their routine. He didn't just show up when he needed something or when it suited him. He showed up because he wanted to. He wanted to be there for Jane, to support her, and, in his own way, he wanted to make up for the emptiness he had felt for so long. Jane, too, found herself letting go of the fear that had once held her back. She started to realize that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had always thought. She allowed herself to be vulnerable with David, to let him see the parts of her she had kept hidden for years. And slowly, the walls she had built around her heart began to crumble. One afternoon, as they sat together on the couch, Lily came into the room, her small feet padding across the floor. She stopped in front of David, looking up at him with wide eyes. "Are you staying for dinner?" she asked, her voice soft, yet full of hope. David looked at Jane, a silent question in his eyes. Jane smiled, her heart swelling with an emotion she hadn't felt in a long time. "Of course," she said, her voice steady, filled with warmth. "I think we'd like that." And in that moment, something shifted. David realized that, for the first time in years, he was truly part of something. He wasn't just the Mafia boss, the man who controlled everything. He was just David, the man who was learning what it meant to love and be loved in return. And Jane, with Lily by her side, realized that she had found a new chapter in her life, one that wasn't defined by survival alone, but by the possibility of something more. Together, they were building something neither of them had expected, but something that was beginning to feel like it could be everything they had both been searching for. Days had passed since that evening, and as much as Jane tried to focus on her daily routine, her mind kept returning to the moments they had shared. The connection between her and David was undeniable, and as much as she told herself to keep her distance, she found herself drawn to him in ways she never expected. It wasn't just about the gifts, the moments of laughter, or the quiet support he offered. It was something deeper, something that made her feel seen and appreciated in a way she hadn't felt in years. David, for his part, was feeling the shift, too. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to be the cold, unapproachable man everyone knew him as. Jane had a way of making him feel human again. He had always prided himself on his control over everything in his life, but with Jane, that control slipped through his fingers. And strangely, he didn't mind. He found himself wanting to be a better person, not just for her, but for himself. But the world they lived in, the world of power, secrecy, and responsibility, was never far behind. There was always the weight of his position, the expectations that came with being who he was. One evening, as they sat together in Jane's apartment, Lily playing quietly in the background, David's phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up, his expression hardening as he glanced at the screen. It was a message from one of his associates. Jane noticed the change in his demeanor immediately. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. David hesitated for a moment, his eyes meeting hers. He could feel the pull between them, the desire to be open, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to pull her into his world completely. "It's just business," he said, his voice steady, though Jane could hear the tension in it. "I'll handle it." Jane studied him for a moment, sensing that there was more to it than he was letting on. But she didn't press him. She had learned that David was a man who carried his burdens alone, and she respected that. "I'm here if you need to talk," she said gently, her voice offering the comfort he hadn't realized he was seeking. David looked at her, his gaze softening. There was a warmth in her eyes that made him want to confide in her, to let her into the parts of his life that he had kept hidden. But he couldn't. Not yet. He wasn't ready to drag her into the darkness that followed him. "I appreciate that," he said quietly, his voice a little rougher than usual. The tension lingered between them, but for a moment, it felt like they were both in the same space, understanding each other without needing words. Jane could feel the weight of his silence, but she didn't push. She had learned that some things had to be given time to unfold. The next day, David found himself at a crossroads. He had made a promise to Jane, not out loud, but to himself, that he would be better, that he would try to let go of the cold exterior he had built for so long. But the reality of his world kept pulling him back. He had made enemies, and the threats didn't stop just because he wanted something more. He knew he had to face it, but the thought of bringing Jane into it, of risking her safety, was something he couldn't bear. He picked up his phone again, his fingers hovering over the screen. A message flashed up from one of his most trusted men. "We have a problem. You need to take care of it." David's heart sank. He didn't want to go back to the world that had once defined him, but he knew he didn't have a choice. He had to protect what was his business, his life, and now, it seemed, his feelings for Jane. As he stared at the screen, he felt a surge of frustration. He wasn't sure how to balance these two worlds. But one thing was clear, he wasn't willing to lose her. He couldn't. When he arrived at Jane's apartment later that evening, there was an intensity in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. She was sitting on the couch, a book in her hands, Lily beside her, both of them lost in their own world. The moment he stepped inside, Jane looked up and saw the tension in his posture. "David?" she asked softly, standing up. "What's wrong?" David took a deep breath, trying to push the weight of his day aside. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Jane's heart skipped a beat. She had never seen him like this before. He was always the one in control, the one who held all the answers. But now, she could see the vulnerability in him, the uncertainty. And for the first time, she realized that maybe, just maybe, he needed her, too. "You don't have to tell me everything," she said gently, stepping toward him. "But if you want to talk, I'm here." David looked at her, his eyes softening for a moment. He knew that he couldn't keep her at arm's length forever. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to let her in. "I don't want to drag you into my world," he said, his voice low. "But I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not." Jane placed her hand gently on his arm, offering him the comfort he had always given others but never accepted for himself. "You don't have to face it alone," she said softly. And in that moment, something shifted between them. David realized that he didn't have to carry the weight of his world by himself. And maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to bring the two worlds together. He didn't know how it would work, but for the first time, he was willing to try. David had spent his whole life protecting his world with walls so high that no one could ever get close. But somehow, Jane had slipped through those defenses without him even noticing. He hadn't expected this. This feeling of vulnerability, of wanting to open up, of wanting to share his life with her. But here they were, sitting together, the tension that had once filled the room now replaced by something else. Something warmer. As they sat across from each other, Jane could sense the shift in David. He had always been the man who controlled everything, but now, he was looking at her with something that wasn't about power or authority. It was something softer, something that made her heart beat a little faster. "You've been distant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to push you, but I can tell something's bothering you." David hesitated for a moment. He wasn't used to sharing his feelings, not with anyone, especially not with her. But the longer he sat in silence, the more he realized that he couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. Not with Jane. Not anymore. "I've spent my whole life building walls," he said, his voice low, filled with a raw honesty that surprised even him. "Walls to keep people out, to keep me safe from everything. But with you, Jane, I feel like I'm losing control." Jane didn't know how to respond at first. She wasn't sure what to say to that. She had always admired his strength, his ability to take charge, but now, hearing him admit this, she realized just how much he had been holding back. "You don't have to lose control," she said softly, her hand reaching out to gently rest on his. "You don't have to carry everything alone." David's eyes met hers, and for the first time, he saw the truth in her words. She wasn't asking for anything from him, but she was offering something more, something that was more than he had ever imagined. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice filled with a mix of frustration and vulnerability. "I've never let anyone in before. I've always been the one who controls everything, but now I'm not sure what to do." Jane smiled, a gentle, understanding smile that seemed to reach into the very core of him. "You don't have to know everything," she said. "You just have to be willing to try." Her words hit him like a wave, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to be perfect. He didn't have to have all the answers. He just had to be real. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared of letting you in, scared of what it means, scared of what it'll do to me." Jane squeezed his hand, her touch grounding him. "I'm scared too," she said, her voice soft but steady. "But sometimes, the best things in life come when we take that leap of faith. When we stop trying to control everything and just let things happen." David looked at her, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent so much of his life hiding, afraid of what might happen if he let someone in. But Jane wasn't just anyone. She was different. And maybe, just maybe, he could trust her. "I'm willing to try," he said, his voice steady now, a new sense of determination in his eyes. "I'm willing to try with you." Jane smiled, the warmth of her gaze making him feel like everything would be okay, even though he had no idea where this journey would lead. But for the first time, he was ready to find out. And for the first time in his life, he didn't have to do it alone. As the evening stretched on, they sat together, their hearts slowly opening to the possibility of something more. David didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he knew that Jane had become an unexpected part of it. And for the first time, he felt something he had never felt before: hope. David stood in front of the window, the city lights below casting a soft glow against the dark sky. His thoughts were a whirlwind, each one tangled with the next, but one thing was clear: his life was no longer the same. Jane had stepped into it, slowly and unknowingly unraveling everything he had once held on to. For so long, he had been the man who kept his distance, who controlled everything. But with Jane, he felt like he was being pulled in a direction he hadn't expected. She wasn't like anyone he had ever known. She didn't ask for anything from him. She didn't want his money or his power. She wanted him. And that, more than anything, made her the most dangerous woman he had ever encountered. But as much as he tried to resist the pull, he couldn't deny what was happening between them. There was a connection that was undeniable, a bond that went beyond the surface. Jane had become a part of his life in a way that no one ever had. And for the first time, he realized that he didn't want to lose her. He had spent his whole life building walls, pushing people away, but with Jane, he didn't want to push her away anymore. He wanted her to stay. He wanted to be with her. As the days went by, David found himself spending more and more time with Jane and Lily. The little moments they shared, the quiet dinners, the walks through the park, the evenings spent in the warmth of her apartment, became his refuge. It wasn't the life he had once imagined for himself, but it was a life he was beginning to want. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something real, something that didn't revolve around power or control. It was just them, and that was enough. Jane, too, found herself falling for David in a way she hadn't expected. She had always kept her heart guarded, afraid to let anyone in, but with David, it was different. There was something about him that made her feel safe, something that made her believe, even for a moment, that there was a possibility of happiness beyond her everyday struggles. But she couldn't ignore the voice in her head that warned her about getting too close. David's world was dangerous, unpredictable. She had seen the way people looked at him, the way they treated him with a mix of fear and respect. He wasn't the type of man to be tied down. And yet, every time she looked into his eyes, she saw something different. He wasn't just the Mafia boss, the man who ran everything with an iron fist. He was someone else, someone who was capable of love and tenderness. Someone who, for the first time in a long time, was willing to open up. But as much as she wanted to believe in that, she couldn't shake the fear that he would eventually walk away. It was the same fear she had carried with her for years, the fear of being abandoned, the fear of being left behind when things got too complicated. She had seen it happen before, and she didn't know if she could handle it again. But despite her fears, she found herself allowing herself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make it work. Maybe, just maybe, they could build something together. David turned away from the window, his eyes searching for Jane in the quiet room. She was sitting on the couch, her eyes on Lily as she played with her toys, but there was something in her expression that he couldn't ignore. It was the same hesitation he had seen before, the same fear that she wasn't fully letting herself be a part of his world. He walked over to her, his steps quiet, and knelt down in front of her, his hands resting on her knees. "Jane," he said softly, his voice low and sincere. "You don't have to be afraid. I'm not going anywhere." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find the truth in his words. "I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not just about us. It's about everything else. Your world. It's dangerous, David." David reached out and cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing over her cheek. "I know it's complicated," he said, his voice steady. "But I promise you, I will do whatever it takes to protect you and Lily. I'm not going to let anything happen to you." Jane's heart ached at the sincerity in his eyes. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that they could have a future together, that they could make it work despite the challenges. But there was still a part of her that was scared, a part of her that wasn't sure if she could trust in that promise. "I don't want to lose you," David continued, his voice filled with emotion. "I don't want to lose this." Jane looked at him for a long moment, her heart torn between fear and hope. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay," she said, her words filled with uncertainty, but also with a willingness to take a chance. And in that moment, David knew that, no matter what came next, he was ready to face it with her by his side.